The world of mutants is not built for stability. It is built for survival. Cities become battlefields overnight, schools become fortresses, and every alliance carries the quiet knowledge that tomorrow may erase it. Within this unstable terrain, identity is rarely private. Every choice reverberates across a battlefield of politics, fear, and visibility. To be a mutant is to exist under a permanent spotlight, a symbol before one can ever be a person. The X-Men emerge within this climate not simply as heroes, but as a social experiment. They are a fragile attempt to construct order within a world that expects their extinction. The mansion functions as both sanctuary and frontier outpost, a place where ideals are trained alongside combat skills. Beneath its quiet corridors runs a deeper pressure. These young people are being prepared not merely for adulthood, but for a life defined by constant confrontation with death. Within this environment, intimacy becomes a strange and unstable currency. Relationships are formed under conditions where permanence cannot be assumed. The next mission might be the last. The next encounter with humanity may transform allies into fugitives. Emotional bonds therefore develop under an unusual gravity, pulled between urgency and restraint, attachment and caution. Love in such a world cannot resemble the quiet domestic forms imagined by societies that expect tomorrow to look like today. It is here that three figures gradually take shape within the same orbit: Scott Summers, Jean Grey, and Logan. Their names eventually become inseparable from the mythology of the X-Men, yet the psychological structure that binds them begins long before any visible conflict appears. At first glance, they appear simply as teammates navigating the same battlefield. Beneath that surface, however, their presence begins to bend the emotional architecture of the group itself. Scott represents order, discipline, structure. His entire life is organized around containment. His power demands control, his leadership demands sacrifice, and his identity is built upon the idea that chaos must be restrained before it consumes everything. He becomes the spine of the team, the figure who stands between catastrophe and coherence. Jean enters the same space as something different. Not merely another soldier in the emerging mutant struggle, but a gravitational center around which emotional and psychic forces begin to orbit. Her abilities blur the line between mind and matter, perception and influence. She does not simply participate in the psychological atmosphere of the team. She amplifies it. Then there is Logan, a presence that arrives from outside the architecture Scott is trying to build. He carries history rather than structure, instinct rather than order. His relationship with violence is older, more intimate, less apologetic. Where Scott represents the attempt to civilize power, Logan embodies the recognition that power has always been wild. At first, these three forces coexist without open fracture. The team trains together, fights together, survives together. Their proximity is explained by circumstance, by the necessities of the battlefield, by the simple fact that mutants with extraordinary abilities are rare and must rely on each other. The emotional field that forms between them remains largely unspoken. Yet even before the first visible conflict, something is already moving beneath the surface. Not hostility, not rivalry, something more subtle and more difficult to contain. A psychological triangulation begins to take shape, one that none of them initially recognizes as a problem. It is simply the natural consequence of their proximity within a world where emotional intensity is magnified by danger. Jean becomes the quiet center of that triangle, not because she seeks it, and not because the narrative initially frames her as an object of competition. Instead, she functions as a mirror that reflects different aspects of the men around her. Scott sees in her the possibility of stability within chaos, a partner who understands the weight of responsibility. Logan sees something else entirely, a rare point of connection in a life defined by isolation and perpetual displacement. Neither interpretation is false. Both emerge naturally from the emotional conditions in which they exist. What makes the situation unstable is not that two men desire the same woman. That is a simple narrative device repeated endlessly across fiction. The deeper instability lies in the fact that each connection is psychologically authentic. Scott's bond with Jean is rooted in shared structure. They are both products of the same fragile institution, attempting to give purpose to mutant existence. Their intimacy grows out of mutual discipline, mutual restraint, and the quiet recognition that both of them carry expectations larger than themselves. Their relationship feels like a foundation. Logan's connection with Jean emerges from an entirely different place. It is not structured, not planned, not filtered through institutional roles or leadership responsibilities. It appears instead as a raw point of emotional recognition between two individuals who see beyond each other's defenses. Their connection feels immediate, almost dangerous in its honesty. At first, these two emotional currents exist side by side without demanding resolution. The team has larger problems. Humanity fears mutants. Governments consider them threats. Every mission carries the possibility of loss. Under such conditions, the quiet complexity of a romantic triangle seems almost irrelevant. But the battlefield has a way of amplifying internal tensions rather than dissolving them. Every act of heroism reinforces the bonds between these three figures. Every near-death encounter deepens their reliance on each other. The psychological field surrounding them grows denser with each shared crisis. Eventually, the question emerges not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a slow realization. What does love look like in a world where survival is never guaranteed? What does loyalty mean when the people you care about may vanish tomorrow? And perhaps most unsettling of all, do the emotional rules inherited from stable societies still make sense inside a war that never ends? Within the mythology of the X-Men, this question does not appear as philosophical speculation. It appears as lived tension, a structure of relationships that refuses to resolve into a single correct answer. Scott, Jean, and Logan become the stage upon which that tension plays out. Their story, therefore, does not begin as a failure to choose. It begins as the emergence of a possibility that traditional narratives of romance rarely allow themselves to examine. The possibility that under extreme conditions, love might not behave according to the rules people expect it to follow. And once that possibility appears, the entire emotional architecture of their world begins to shift. The psychological architecture that eventually forms between Scott Summers, Jean Grey, and Logan does not begin with romance. It begins with formation. Each of them enters the world of the X-Men already shaped by environments that forced premature adaptation. Before they ever become participants in the same emotional field, they are already products of different survival strategies. Those strategies will later collide. Scott's formation begins with absence and containment. From an early age, his life is defined by loss, separation, and institutional structure. Authority replaces family. Discipline replaces emotional spontaneity. His power itself becomes the most visible expression of this condition. His eyes cannot be opened freely without unleashing destructive force. Vision itself must be controlled. The world literally cannot be looked at directly. Over time, this condition becomes more than a physical constraint. It becomes a psychological orientation. Scott internalizes the idea that power must be restrained in order for the world to remain intact. His identity therefore crystallizes around responsibility. Leadership becomes less a choice and more a continuation of the survival strategy he learned as a child. Control keeps catastrophe at bay. Jean's formation follows a different path. Her power does not erupt outward through visible destruction. It moves inward. Perception expands until the boundary between self and others becomes porous. She becomes aware of emotions before they are spoken, tensions before they are articulated. Where Scott's power forces him to close himself off, Jean's power opens her to the psychological currents surrounding her. This creates a unique position within the social structure of the X-Men. Jean often understands people before they fully understand themselves. Yet that awareness carries its own burden. To perceive the emotional reality of others is to live within a constant field of echoes, projections, fears, and desires that are not entirely one's own. Jean therefore learns to navigate a psychological terrain where empathy and distance must coexist. Logan enters the narrative carrying an entirely different psychological structure. His life precedes the institutional order that shaped Scott and Jean. He emerges from a long history of displacement, experimentation, violence, and survival on the margins of civilization. His identity is not constructed through training or ideology. It is carved through endurance. Memory itself becomes unstable in Logan's life. Large portions of his past exist as fragments rather than coherent narrative. The result is a psyche oriented around instinct rather than structure. Where Scott relies on systems and discipline to maintain order, Logan relies on immediate perception. The present moment becomes his primary ground of existence. These three psychological orientations are already in motion before they intersect. Scott represents the architecture of restraint. Jean represents expanded perception within that architecture. Logan represents the disruptive presence of instinct moving through the same terrain. When they eventually occupy the same social space, their internal structures begin interacting long before romance is explicitly acknowledged. Within the X-Men, this interaction is initially stabilized by hierarchy. Scott leads. Jean supports that leadership while developing her own role within the team's psychic landscape. Logan remains peripheral at first, a powerful but unpredictable figure whose relationship with authority is ambiguous. The structure appears stable, yet psychological systems rarely remain static when powerful personalities share the same environment. Logan's presence introduces a variable that Scott's framework cannot fully integrate. Logan does not respond to authority in the same way the rest of the team does. His respect must be earned through action rather than granted through position. Jean becomes the subtle point where these two orientations intersect. She understands Scott's burden because she has witnessed the internal pressure that leadership places upon him. She also recognizes the loneliness beneath Logan's defiance because her perception reaches past his defensive exterior. The result is not immediate conflict. It is resonance. Scott sees in Jean someone who shares his sense of responsibility. Their bond forms within the structure of the team itself. They are both invested in the project that Professor Xavier represents, the attempt to construct a future where mutants can coexist with humanity without perpetual war. Their relationship, therefore, carries the weight of that larger vision. Logan experiences Jean through a different lens. He is less invested in ideological futures. His life has taught him that institutions rise and fall, promises collapse, and systems designed to protect often become systems of control. What he recognizes in Jean is something more immediate, a rare moment of unguarded human connection within a life that has been defined by isolation. This difference in perception quietly reorganizes the emotional terrain around them. Scott's relationship with Jean is intertwined with responsibility, leadership, and shared purpose. Logan's connection with her exists outside that structure. It is personal rather than institutional, instinctive rather than disciplined. The tension that emerges from this arrangement is not initially antagonistic. In many ways, the three of them function as complementary forces within the team. Scott provides strategic clarity. Logan provides raw combat capability and unpredictable insight. Jean moves between them, translating emotional undercurrents that others cannot fully articulate. However, psychological triangulations rarely remain stable indefinitely. When two individuals relate to the same person through fundamentally different emotional logics, Comparison eventually emerges, even if none of them consciously seek it. The presence of one relationship begins to illuminate the limitations of the other. Scott's structure emphasizes reliability and long-term stability. Logan's presence emphasizes authenticity and emotional immediacy. Jean experiences both simultaneously. The effect is not confusion. It is expansion. Each connection activates a different dimension of her identity. From the outside, this arrangement may appear unstable. From within the psychological reality of the characters, however, it reflects the complexity of their lives. They inhabit a world where death is not abstract. Missions fail. Friends disappear. Entire populations turn hostile overnight. The emotional timelines available to them are compressed by constant danger. In such an environment, relationships cannot rely on the assumption of permanence. Every moment of connection carries the implicit awareness that it may be temporary. This awareness subtly alters the ethical framework through which intimacy is understood. Emotional survival begins to matter as much as social convention. Scott still attempts to maintain the stability he believes the team requires. His commitment to Jean remains sincere and deeply felt, yet his role as leader forces him to prioritize collective survival over personal spontaneity. Logan, by contrast, has no such obligation. His emotional expression is direct precisely because he does not carry the same institutional weight. Jean finds herself positioned between these two orientations not by design, but by circumstance. She does not simply receive their attention. She becomes the reflective surface through which each of them confronts aspects of themselves they cannot easily acknowledge. Scott sees the cost of constant restraint. Logan sees the possibility of belonging. At this stage, the triangle is not yet a conflict. It is a psychological field forming around three individuals who are each responding honestly to the conditions of their lives. The instability lies not in their intentions, but in the fact that their emotional truths cannot easily be reconciled within the traditional structures that normally organize romantic relationships. The battlefield surrounding the X-Men ensures that this unresolved tension will not remain theoretical. Eventually, circumstances will force the emotional architecture between them to reveal its underlying fractures. And when that moment arrives, the question will no longer be whether they care for each other. The question will be what form that care can take inside a world where tomorrow is never guaranteed. The moment when the emotional architecture surrounding Scott Summers, Jean Grey, and Logan begins to change does not arrive as a dramatic rupture. It unfolds slowly, almost invisibly, through the accumulation of shared experiences that gradually alter the gravity between them. The X-Men operate within a world where proximity and danger are inseparable. Missions demand cooperation under pressure. Survival often depends on trusting the person standing beside you without hesitation. Under these conditions, the emotional field between individuals deepens rapidly. The battlefield compresses time. Weeks of shared conflict can produce bonds that might otherwise take years to form. Scott understands this dynamic instinctively because leadership requires him to monitor not only strategy, but also morale, cohesion, and trust within the team. At first, Logan's presence simply adds another variable to the tactical environment. His combat instincts make him invaluable in situations where discipline alone cannot guarantee survival. Scott recognizes this utility, even if he finds Logan's methods difficult to integrate into the structure he is trying to maintain. Their cooperation becomes pragmatic rather than personal. Jean observes this dynamic from a different vantage point. Her abilities allow her to perceive subtle shifts in emotional atmosphere long before they manifest outwardly. She senses the friction between Scott's commitment to order and Logan's refusal to submit entirely to that order. Yet she also perceives something beneath that tension, a reluctant recognition between two men who both carry the burden of protecting others. The earliest fractures in the triangle therefore emerge not from rivalry, but from contrast. Scott operates within the logic of responsibility. Every decision is filtered through its consequences for the group. Logan operates within the logic of immediacy. When danger appears, instinct moves faster than deliberation. In combat, this difference often becomes an advantage. There are moments on the battlefield where Scott's structured approach creates a strategic opening that Logan can exploit with ruthless efficiency. There are other moments when Logan's unpredictable aggression forces Scott to adjust plans in real time. The two men begin to function as opposing forces within the same tactical system. Jean becomes the axis around which these forces rotate. She witnesses the effectiveness of Scott's discipline and the raw necessity of Logan's instinct. Each reveals something about the nature of survival within the mutant struggle. Neither approach can entirely replace the other. The battlefield itself seems to require both. Over time, these practical interactions begin to bleed into the personal dimension of their lives. The mansion may function as a refuge, but it is also a place where exhaustion and vulnerability accumulate after every mission. The same individuals who fight together must also process the psychological residue of those encounters within the same walls. Scott handles this burden by reinforcing structure. Training schedules continue. Strategic briefings continue. Leadership demands continuity, even when emotional fatigue begins to spread through the team. His relationship with Jean grows deeper within this framework. She becomes one of the few people who understands the pressure that accompanies constant responsibility. Logan approaches the same emotional environment differently. He does not attempt to impose structure on the aftermath of conflict. Instead, he withdraws from it. The edges of the mansion become his territory, the places where distance from the group allows him to maintain the internal equilibrium he relies upon. It is there that Jean occasionally encounters him. These encounters are rarely planned. They emerge through coincidence, quiet conversations after long missions, moments where the emotional noise of the mansion recedes enough for honesty to surface. Logan does not speak easily about himself, yet Jean's presence lowers the defensive barriers that normally surround him. She does not interrogate him. She simply listens. The effect is subtle but profound. Logan is accustomed to environments where people either fear him or attempt to control him. Jean does neither. Her ability to perceive the emotional terrain beneath his surface responses allows her to meet him without forcing him into confession. For Logan, this creates a rare experience of recognition. Someone sees beyond the feral exterior without attempting to reshape it. Someone acknowledges the damage carried beneath his instincts without treating it as something that must be corrected. The result is not dependency but resonance. Meanwhile, Scott continues to build a future-oriented structure around the team. His relationship with Jean grows through shared commitment. They discuss strategy, responsibility, and the fragile political balance the X-Men are trying to maintain within a hostile world. Their bond feels durable because it is built upon the same foundation that supports the team itself. At this stage, neither relationship undermines the other. Jean experiences them as different dimensions of connection rather than competing claims. Scott represents stability and long-term partnership within a shared mission. Logan represents emotional immediacy within a life that rarely allows such moments. The tension begins to intensify when these two emotional logics start occupying the same psychological space. Scott cannot entirely ignore the subtle shifts in Jean's attention when Logan is present. Leadership has sharpened his awareness of interpersonal dynamics. He notices the small moments of unspoken understanding between them. Logan notices something as well. He understands instinctively that Scott's connection with Jean predates his own. Logan does not attempt to disrupt that structure directly, yet his presence refuses to remain peripheral. Emotional gravity begins to pull the three of them closer into the same field of perception. Jean becomes increasingly aware that her own feelings cannot easily be categorized according to conventional expectations. Her bond with Scott remains genuine. It is built upon trust, shared struggle, and a long history of facing danger together. Yet the connection she feels with Logan does not fade simply because it complicates that structure. Instead, it intensifies in the spaces where vulnerability becomes unavoidable. When missions end with casualties, when the cost of the mutant struggle becomes visible in the faces of friends who did not return, the emotional barriers that normally organize relationships begin to weaken. Under these conditions, honesty becomes difficult to suppress. The battlefield outside the mansion continues to escalate. Mutant existence grows more precarious with each passing year. Governments experiment with containment strategies. Public fear becomes institutional policy. The X-Men find themselves operating in an increasingly hostile environment where survival requires constant readiness. Within this climate, the emotional triangle between Scott, Jean, and Logan becomes less theoretical. It begins to influence real decisions, subtle shifts in loyalty, moments where personal feelings intersect with strategic necessity. None of them openly declares the situation as a conflict. Yet the structure is no longer stable. The psychological field surrounding them has begun to reorganize itself. The gravitational forces of discipline, instinct, and perception are moving closer together, compressing the space in which traditional expectations about love and loyalty can comfortably exist. The battlefield has begun to reshape the emotional rules by which they live, and none of them yet knows what those new rules will demand. The escalation of tension between Scott Summers, Jean Grey, and Logan does not originate within the triangle itself. It emerges from the world surrounding them. The mutant struggle intensifies with every passing year, and the battlefield expands beyond isolated confrontations into a permanent state of siege. Governments no longer merely fear mutants. They begin to design systems to contain them. For the X-Men, this transformation alters the emotional climate inside the mansion. Missions grow more dangerous, but the greater shift lies in their frequency. There is less time between crises, less time for recovery, less space for the quiet normalization of everyday life. What once felt like intermittent warfare begins to resemble permanent conflict. Under these conditions, Scott's role as leader becomes heavier. Strategy can no longer be episodic. It must become continuous. Every decision carries consequences that extend far beyond the immediate mission. Alliances with human institutions grow more fragile. Public hostility grows louder. The margin for error shrinks. Scott responds to this pressure by tightening the structure he believes keeps the team intact. Discipline intensifies. Training becomes more rigorous. Emotional complications are treated as secondary to operational effectiveness. He does not consciously suppress personal feelings, but the demands of leadership force him to prioritize the survival of the group above all else. Jean understands this burden intimately. She perceives the quiet exhaustion that accumulates behind Scott's composed exterior. His control is not merely a leadership trait. It is the psychological mechanism that allows him to function under constant responsibility. Without it, the entire structure he maintains would collapse. Yet Jean also feels the cost of that control. The emotional distance required by Scott's role creates spaces that cannot easily be filled by duty alone. Their relationship remains strong, yet it is shaped by the same institutional gravity that organizes the X-Men themselves. Love becomes intertwined with obligation. Logan exists outside this structure, and the escalating conflict around them reinforces that position rather than dissolving it. He participates in missions with brutal efficiency, but he does not internalize the ideological framework that Scott represents. His loyalty is personal rather than institutional. He fights beside the X-Men because he chooses to, not because he believes in a long-term strategy of coexistence. This difference becomes increasingly visible as the stakes rise. Scott sees the mutant struggle as a historical project. A future must be built where mutants and humans can inhabit the same world without annihilating each other. Every sacrifice, therefore, becomes part of a larger narrative. Logan views the same battlefield through a narrower but more immediate lens. He does not deny the importance of long-term survival, but his instincts remain rooted in the present moment. Protect the people who matter. Eliminate the threat in front of you. Worry about tomorrow when tomorrow arrives. Jean stands between these perspectives, able to feel the emotional truth within both. Scott's vision of the future carries a moral gravity that cannot be dismissed. Logan's immediacy carries a raw honesty that cannot be ignored. Each represents a different form of courage within the same war. As the external conflict intensifies, the emotional triangle begins to mirror the larger struggle unfolding around them. Scott represents structure under pressure, an attempt to hold the line against chaos. Logan represents adaptation under pressure, the willingness to abandon structure when survival demands it. Jean becomes the living intersection of those forces. The first real fracture appears not during a private conversation, but during a mission where the consequences of hesitation become visible. The X-Men face an opponent whose power threatens civilians caught within the crossfire. Scott calculates the situation according to strategic necessity. Containment must come first. Collateral damage must be minimized through controlled engagement. Logan interprets the same moment differently. The immediate threat demands immediate violence. Waiting for the perfect tactical configuration risks allowing the situation to escalate beyond control. Instinct pushes him forward before Scott's full plan is executed. The mission succeeds, but the cost reveals itself afterward. Lives are saved, yet the margin between success and catastrophe becomes painfully clear. Scott sees Logan's impulsive action as a destabilizing factor within the team's operational structure. Logan sees Scott's hesitation as the product of overanalysis in a moment that required decisive action. Jean perceives the deeper layer beneath this disagreement. Both men acted according to the psychological logic that has sustained them throughout their lives. Scott preserved order. Logan embraced risk. Neither can easily adopt the other's orientation without undermining the identity that has kept them alive. The emotional consequences of this realization begin to ripple outward. Scott grows more aware of the subtle connection between Jean and Logan, particularly in moments where instinct and empathy align more quickly than strategy. He does not accuse them of betrayal. His discomfort emerges from a quieter place. Scott begins to recognize that the emotional world Jean shares with Logan exists outside the framework he has built around their lives. It is spontaneous where his relationship with Jean is structured. It is unfiltered where his own emotional expression must remain disciplined. Logan recognizes something as well. The bond between Scott and Jean cannot be dismissed as institutional convenience. It is genuine, built upon years of shared struggle and mutual reliance. Logan understands that any movement he makes toward Jean exists within the shadow of that history. Jean experiences the triangle not as a moral puzzle, but as an emotional reality that refuses simplification. Her connection with Scott remains rooted in loyalty, trust, and a shared vision of the future. Her connection with Logan carries a different energy, one that acknowledges the fragility of life within their world. In quieter moments, she begins to recognize that both relationships reflect different responses to the same existential condition. Mutant life offers no guarantee of stability. Every connection may be temporary. Every expression of love may exist under the threat of interruption. The question that begins to form in Jean's mind is not which man she should choose. The deeper question is whether the emotional framework inherited from ordinary society can fully account for the conditions in which they live. The rules that govern romantic exclusivity were shaped within environments that assumed continuity. The X-Men do not inhabit such an environment. Their world is defined by rupture, displacement, and constant confrontation with mortality. Under these conditions, emotional survival may require forms of connection that traditional structures struggle to accommodate. The triangle therefore moves beyond simple rivalry. It becomes a living experiment within the emotional geography of the mutant struggle. Scott, Jean, and Logan are no longer merely individuals navigating private feelings. They have become a microcosm of the broader tension between structure and instinct, loyalty and freedom, permanence and impermanence. The battlefield outside the mansion continues to escalate, yet within its walls another conflict is quietly unfolding, one that may ultimately prove just as difficult to resolve. The moment when the emotional structure between Scott Summers, Jean Grey, and Logan becomes impossible to ignore does not arrive through confession or confrontation. It emerges through accumulation. Years of shared danger, loss, and survival compress their emotional lives into a narrow corridor where avoidance becomes increasingly difficult. The mutant struggle continues to intensify. Governments escalate containment strategies. Anti-mutant movements transform from scattered hostility into organized resistance. Each mission carries greater political consequences, greater media visibility, and greater personal risk for the individuals involved. The X-Men are no longer simply a team operating at the edges of public awareness. They have become symbols. Symbolic existence alters the psychological pressure surrounding personal decisions. Scott feels this transformation acutely. As leader, he is not merely responsible for tactical outcomes. He represents the idea that mutants can live within structures of discipline, restraint, and cooperation. His identity becomes inseparable from that representation. This burden quietly reshapes his relationship with Jean. Their bond remains deeply rooted in trust and shared history, yet Scott increasingly experiences their connection through the lens of responsibility. Their partnership embodies the stability he believes the team requires. Any disruption to that stability threatens not only his private life, but the symbolic coherence of the group. Logan continues to exist outside that symbolic framework. Public narratives surrounding the X-Men rarely account for individuals like him. He is too unpredictable to represent ideological order, too honest in his violence to fit comfortably within the moral image the team projects to the world. Yet his presence remains indispensable on the battlefield. The tension between these roles becomes increasingly visible within the team itself. Younger members watch Scott and Logan closely, often without realizing it. One represents authority grounded in discipline. The other represents authenticity grounded in instinct. Their contrast quietly shapes how the next generation of mutants understands power. Jean feels this tension more directly than anyone else because her emotional awareness places her at the center of the system. She senses the silent expectations forming around Scott's leadership. She also senses the emotional isolation that continues to surround Logan despite his integration into the team. Moments begin to appear where the psychological boundaries between these roles blur. Missions push the team into situations where survival requires not only strategy, but emotional clarity. When lives are at stake, hesitation can become fatal. Decisions must be made with an understanding of both structure and instinct. During one such operation, the team confronts a scenario where the traditional chain of command cannot adapt quickly enough. A rapidly shifting battlefield forces individuals to act on immediate perception rather than coordinated planning. Logan's instincts become the decisive factor that prevents catastrophe. Scott recognizes the necessity of that intervention, even as it unsettles him. Leadership relies on the belief that disciplined coordination produces the best outcomes. Yet the reality of the battlefield occasionally reveals moments where instinct outpaces structure. Logan becomes the embodiment of that uncomfortable truth. Jean witnesses the exchange between them afterward. Scott acknowledges Logan's contribution with restrained sincerity. Logan accepts the recognition with equal restraint. Neither man articulates the deeper implications of the moment, yet both understand that their approaches to survival remain fundamentally different. These moments accumulate. Each mission becomes another demonstration that the mutant struggle cannot be managed through a single psychological orientation. Discipline and instinct continue to coexist within the same system, often uneasily but necessarily. Within the private space between Jean and Logan, however, the emotional consequences of these encounters deepen. Logan's instinctive actions often place him at physical risk. His willingness to absorb damage that others cannot survive creates a strange form of emotional exposure. Jean feels the impact of that risk with increasing intensity. Their conversations remain quiet, often occurring at the edges of the mansion or in the aftermath of missions when adrenaline begins to fade. Logan does not attempt to redefine Jean's relationship with Scott. He recognizes its legitimacy and its history. Yet the connection between them continues to exist. Jean begins to recognize that what she feels for Logan is not simply attraction. It is recognition of a shared vulnerability that emerges when survival becomes uncertain. Logan's life has been defined by impermanence. Attachments have often ended in loss. The possibility of connection, therefore, carries a different emotional weight for him. Scott senses the shift in subtle ways. He notices how Jean's emotional presence changes when Logan is near. He observes how Logan's normally guarded demeanor softens in her presence. These observations do not produce immediate confrontation. Instead, they create a quiet internal pressure. Scott's identity is built upon containment. The instinct to control emotional turbulence becomes stronger as awareness grows. He does not demand answers from Jean. He does not challenge Logan openly. Instead, he attempts to reinforce the structure he believes will stabilize the situation. Yet emotional systems rarely obey structural reinforcement alone. The triangle between them has evolved beyond the point where traditional expectations can easily resolve it. Each connection contains genuine loyalty. Each relationship carries emotional truth that cannot be dismissed as illusion. Jean eventually confronts the situation internally rather than externally. Her heightened perception forces her to examine the emotional terrain with unusual clarity. She understands Scott's fear that instability could fracture the team. She understands Logan's reluctance to disrupt the bond that already exists between Scott and herself. What she also understands is that the emotional reality between them cannot be reduced to a simple decision between two mutually exclusive paths. Her connection with Scott represents shared purpose and deep historical trust. Her connection with Logan represents a raw, emotional honesty forged within the same war. The mutant world surrounding them continues to collapse into greater instability. Friends fall in battle. Entire communities of mutants become targets of coordinated violence. The future that Scott fights to build remains uncertain at best. In such an environment, Jean begins to question whether emotional life can realistically follow the rules developed in peaceful societies. Traditional romantic structures assume time. They assume safety. They assume that life will continue long enough for choices to stabilize into permanent arrangements. The X-Men inhabit a world where those assumptions are constantly undermined. Within this context, the emotional triangle begins to transform from a problem into a reflection of the conditions in which they live. Love does not behave as a static possession that must belong exclusively to one individual. Instead, it becomes a network of connections that sustain psychological resilience within a life defined by danger. Scott slowly comes to recognize this possibility, though the realization is uncomfortable. His instinct remains to preserve order wherever possible. Yet the deeper loyalty that binds the three of them begins to reveal something unexpected. The presence of Logan in Jean's emotional life does not erase her bond with Scott. Likewise, Logan's connection with Jean does not transform him into an adversary of Scott. Their shared experiences on the battlefield create a strange form of mutual recognition. They remain different men shaped by different survival strategies, yet both understand the stakes of the world they inhabit. The triangle therefore stabilizes not through resolution, but through acknowledgement. None of them attempts to fully define what their connection must become. Instead, they allow the emotional structure to exist within the unstable reality of mutant life. This choice does not eliminate tension. It does not dissolve jealousy or uncertainty. Yet it reflects a deeper adaptation to the world they inhabit. Love within a war zone cannot always conform to the expectations developed in environments where survival is taken for granted. By the time this realization settles into the emotional landscape of their lives, the triangle between Scott, Jean, and Logan has already transformed into something larger than a romantic complication. It has become a psychological response to the permanent instability of their world. And that response will soon extend beyond the three individuals themselves, shaping how audiences interpret the meaning of intimacy, loyalty, and survival within the mythology of the X-Men. Once the emotional architecture between Scott Summers, Jean Grey, and Logan becomes visible within the mythology of the X-Men, it begins to operate beyond the narrative itself. The triangle ceases to function merely as a private relationship dynamic between three characters. It becomes a symbolic arena where audiences project their own assumptions about love, loyalty, masculinity, and emotional legitimacy. This transformation occurs because the X-Men were never simply a superhero team. From their earliest appearances, they functioned as a cultural mirror reflecting social anxieties about difference, belonging, and coexistence. The mutant metaphor transforms individual conflicts into symbolic battlegrounds where deeper cultural tensions can be explored without direct confrontation. Within that symbolic arena, the relationship between Scott, Jean, and Logan begins to represent competing visions of emotional order. Scott embodies the promise that stability and discipline can create lasting structures within chaos. His relationship with Jean appears to follow the familiar narrative of partnership grounded in shared values and long-term commitment. Logan introduces a competing interpretation of intimacy. His connection with Jean resists institutional definition. It emerges through emotional immediacy rather than long-term planning. Where Scott's love is built upon continuity and shared responsibility, Logan's attachment exists within the fragile present moment of lives constantly threatened by violence. Audiences observing this dynamic often respond by attempting to resolve it through familiar frameworks. Cultural narratives about romance typically demand clarity. One connection must be legitimate, while the other must represent disruption or temptation. Popular discussion frequently frames the triangle as a competition between order and desire, loyalty and instinct. Yet the narrative itself repeatedly resists that simplification. Each relationship persists with emotional authenticity. Scott's devotion to Jean remains sincere, even when his leadership obligations complicate their private life. Logan's connection with Jean refuses to fade even when he recognizes the legitimacy of her bond with Scott. Jean herself resists becoming the passive object of male rivalry that conventional storytelling might demand. Her emotional awareness allows her to recognize the truth present in both connections. Rather than treating love as a possession that must be awarded to one claimant, she experiences it as a field of relationships shaped by the unstable conditions of mutant existence. This refusal to collapse the triangle into a single resolution creates a subtle disturbance within the audience's interpretive expectations. Readers and viewers find themselves confronting the possibility that emotional truth may not always align with the structures through which society organizes romantic relationships. The mutant world amplifies this disturbance because its conditions destabilize the assumptions upon which those structures normally depend. Human societies develop romantic norms within environments where life expectancy, social continuity, and physical safety can be reasonably expected. Love becomes organized around permanence. The lives of mutants rarely offer such guarantees. Every mission carries the possibility of irreversible loss. Entire communities may be destroyed within a single political decision. Individuals who form emotional bonds under these circumstances inhabit a psychological landscape where tomorrow cannot be assumed. Within that landscape, the question of romantic exclusivity acquires a different texture. Loyalty remains meaningful, yet its expression may not conform to traditional boundaries. Emotional survival may depend upon connections that operate simultaneously rather than sequentially. The triangle between Scott, Jean, and Logan therefore becomes a symbolic experiment conducted within the emotional geography of a permanent war zone. Their relationships reveal how individuals adapt psychologically when the conditions that normally stabilize social institutions begin to dissolve. This symbolic function extends beyond the characters themselves into the cultural communities that engage with their story. Fans frequently organize themselves into opposing camps that defend one relationship over the other. Some interpret Scott as the rightful partner whose loyalty and discipline represent moral clarity. Others interpret Logan as the authentic emotional counterpart whose honesty exposes the limitations of institutional order. These divisions mirror the deeper tension embedded within the narrative itself. Audiences project their own beliefs about love, responsibility, and authenticity onto the characters, transforming the triangle into a cultural debate about the legitimacy of competing emotional values. Within this process, Jean often becomes the most misunderstood figure. Popular discourse frequently attempts to reduce her role to that of a prize over which two men struggle. Yet the narrative repeatedly positions her as the emotional center of the system, rather than its passive object. Her expanded perception allows her to inhabit the psychological realities of both men simultaneously. She understands the cost of Scott's leadership because she witnesses the pressure it places upon him. She understands Logan's loneliness because she perceives the emotional isolation created by his history. In this sense, Jean functions as a reflective surface that reveals the deeper motivations operating beneath each man's behavior. Scott's discipline emerges not from emotional repression, but from a lifelong attempt to protect others from the destructive potential he carries. Logan's ferocity emerges not from simple aggression, but from the scars of a life where survival required constant readiness for violence. The cultural resonance of their triangle, therefore, extends into questions about masculinity itself. Scott represents a model of masculine responsibility grounded in restraint, duty, and long-term commitment. Logan represents a model grounded in instinct, authenticity, and emotional immediacy. Jean's presence exposes the strengths and limitations of both. Audiences responding to this dynamic often reveal their own anxieties about which form of masculinity should dominate the emotional landscape of modern relationships. The debate surrounding Scott and Logan becomes a proxy for larger cultural questions about authority, vulnerability, control, and freedom. At the same time, the narrative quietly undermines the idea that either model can fully replace the other. The mutant struggle repeatedly demonstrates that survival requires both strategic discipline and instinctive adaptation. Scott and Logan therefore function less as rivals than as opposing forces within the same survival system. Jean's ability to maintain meaningful connections with both men reflects an emotional intelligence shaped by the unstable world she inhabits. Her relationships become a form of psychological resilience rather than a failure to choose. They acknowledge that love may appear in multiple forms when life refuses to stabilize around a single predictable future. This interpretation remains unsettling precisely because it challenges the cultural expectation that emotional legitimacy requires exclusivity. The triangle therefore continues to generate debate decades after its introduction, not because it presents a simple romantic puzzle, but but because it exposes the fragility of the rules audiences bring to the story. Within the mythology of the X-Men, the relationship between Scott, Jean, and Logan becomes a symbolic frontier where traditional assumptions about love encounter the psychological realities of a world defined by conflict. The tension between those two forces remains unresolved, and that unresolved quality ensures its enduring cultural power. Over time, the relationship between Scott Summers, Jean Grey, and Logan ceases to be understood merely as a narrative complication inside the mythology of the X-Men. It settles into something more durable, a symbolic structure that continues to operate within the collective imagination long after individual storylines evolve or reset. The triangle becomes sediment rather than event. This permanence emerges from the fact that the conflict between them was never fully resolved in the conventional sense. There was no definitive victory, no final declaration that one form of love had replaced the other. Instead, the narrative repeatedly returned to the same psychological terrain, allowing the tension to remain active rather than closing it through a single decisive moment. Within the mythology of the X-Men, this unfinished quality begins to mirror the larger struggle mutants themselves inhabit. Their war with the world rarely concludes through clear victories. It persists across generations, shifting in form but never disappearing entirely. The emotional lives of the characters begin to reflect that same pattern of continuous negotiation. Scott continues to carry the architecture of responsibility. His leadership evolves through different historical phases of the mutant struggle, yet the psychological foundation remains intact. He embodies the belief that structure and commitment can create a future worth fighting for even when the present appears unstable. Logan continues to represent the opposite pole within that same system. He moves through the narrative as a figure shaped by survival rather than institutional vision. His loyalty to the people around him remains fierce, yet he never fully integrates into the ideological frameworks that define the X-Men as a project. Jean's legacy within the triangle becomes even more complex because her character repeatedly undergoes transformation within the mythology itself. Her power expands beyond telepathic perception into cosmic dimensions of influence and destruction. Yet the emotional center of her character remains rooted in the same relational field that once connected her to Scott and Logan simultaneously. Even when narrative resets alter the timeline, audiences continue to perceive the three of them through the same symbolic structure. Scott represents continuity and responsibility. Logan represents instinct and authenticity. Jean represents the emotional intelligence capable of perceiving both without collapsing into a single answer. The persistence of this structure reveals something deeper about how myth operates within modern storytelling. Characters who endure across decades do not survive because every detail of their narrative remains fixed. They survive because the psychological tensions embedded within them remain relevant to the cultures that continue to revisit them. The triangle, therefore, becomes less about the literal question of who Jean ultimately belongs with and more about the emotional landscape it exposes. The narrative demonstrates that love within unstable conditions cannot always conform to rigid categories. Loyalty may coexist with contradiction. Emotional truth may appear in multiple directions simultaneously. This insight unsettles audiences precisely because it challenges the moral clarity that many romantic narratives promise. Traditional storytelling often resolves emotional conflicts by rewarding one path while closing the others. The relationship between Scott, Jean, and Logan resists that closure. Their story instead reflects the reality that individuals navigating dangerous or unstable worlds often develop emotional strategies that do not fit easily within conventional frameworks. Survival reshapes intimacy. Relationships adapt to circumstances that rarely allow the luxury of ideal arrangements. The mutant world intensifies this dynamic because its instability is not temporary. It is structural. The constant threat of extinction, persecution, or sudden loss alters the emotional calculus through which characters evaluate connection and loyalty. Love becomes intertwined with the urgency of existence itself. Within that context, the triangle becomes a quiet acknowledgement that human attachment may expand under pressure rather than contract. The emotional bonds between Scott, Jean, and Logan demonstrate that individuals confronting existential uncertainty sometimes develop networks of connection rather than singular dependencies. This does not eliminate conflict or jealousy. Those emotions remain present throughout their history. What changes is the recognition that emotional complexity cannot always be reduced to a single correct outcome. The relationships endure precisely because they refuse to collapse into simplicity. Culturally, the triangle continues to function as a symbolic mirror through which audiences explore their own beliefs about intimacy and loyalty. Some viewers remain committed to the idea that Scott's partnership with Jean represents the proper structure for their relationship. Others interpret Logan's connection with her as the more authentic emotional truth. The narrative never fully resolves this debate because the characters themselves embody the legitimacy of both perspectives. Scott's devotion remains unwavering. Logan's connection remains undeniable. Jean's capacity to recognize both persists as the emotional center of the system. Over decades, this unresolved tension becomes part of the mythology surrounding the X-Men themselves. Just as mutants represent the struggle for coexistence within a hostile world, the triangle between Scott, Jean, and Logan represents the struggle to reconcile competing emotional truths within that same environment. The legacy of their relationship therefore extends beyond the boundaries of romantic storytelling. It becomes a reflection of how individuals adapt psychologically when the world around them refuses to stabilize. Love becomes less about possession and more about endurance. In the end, the triangle does not dissolve into resolution. It settles into the narrative landscape as a permanent feature, like a geological formation shaped by immense pressure over time. The forces that created it remain active beneath the surface of the story. Scott continues to stand at the center of structure, holding together a fragile vision of order within chaos. Logan continues to move through the margins of that structure, embodying the instinct that allows survival when order fails. Jean remains the reflective surface through which both forces recognize themselves. Their relationship persists because the conditions that created it persist as well. A world defined by conflict rarely produces simple emotional answers. Instead, it produces bonds shaped by necessity, loyalty, vulnerability, and the constant awareness that tomorrow may never arrive. Within that world, the triangle between Scott Summers, Jean Grey, and Logan becomes something more than a romantic question. It becomes a quiet acknowledgement of the complicated ways love survives when stability disappears.